All right. We're back. It's Leslie and Michael and Ben. And in another video, we talk about current statutory research. And relatedly, today we're just going to talk about the difference between a code section and a session law. So as a lawyer, you might have to go and look up the law on bribery of a public official in Virginia, for example. And usually, without thinking, we would go and do that in a code. We'd be looking up code sections, which is what we talk about in our other video. But in reality, these laws are originally published as session laws. And so, for example, here we have the Acts of Assembly from Virginia. What's contained in here are what's known as session laws or acts, sometimes public laws on the federal level, or just plain laws, but they're different. So you've got code sections and you've got session laws. So what are we talking about here? What exactly is the difference between these two things?
So as Ben noted, session laws in the code, session laws is a very generic term. So we call them session laws because they're the laws that were passed by the legislature, acts of the General Assembly for Virginia or Congress at the federal level, and the laws that were passed in a session of that meeting and published chronologically at the end of the session. So you say session laws is a very generic term. In Virginia, they're the Acts of Assembly. At the federal level, they're called the statutes at large. So what you're talking about are the laws passed during a session of the legislature, printed chronologically at the end of the session. Code is where you take those laws that were passed and you organize them topically. You codify them. You group them by topic. So that's where you get your criminal law or your procedure laws or your property codes all coming from. So at one point they were in the session law, then they take them and organize them and how they fit best together in the current statutory code sections.
And I'll just qualify that a little bit by saying that not every law that is passed in a General Assembly or Congress is codified. So it has to show some permanence, and usually dates are affected if it's a short term. Something like an appropriations bill, something like the historic building naming. So those are not codified, and that's kind of why session laws are important if you do want to look at the Appropriations Act or whatever. So
yeah. That's right, yeah.
And you alluded to the fact of an attorney looking at bribery. Mm-hmm. So if an attorney was looking at a bribery occurring in 2010 and the code is 2016,
right?
How would you handle that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and that's one place where session laws do come up. So the law changes, and especially if you're looking at crimes and other types of laws, you may need to know what the law was at a prior point in history. Codes are kept up to date, and so the current code of Virginia is going to have whatever the law is in effect right now. So if you needed to find out, well, what were the bribery laws in effect back in 2010, that's where you would need to go to the prior session laws to find out, perhaps looking at the amendments passed by the Virginia General Assembly or the original law as passed, so you could trace back the development of the language of that particular code section to see what existed at that particular point.
So the session laws are frozen in time.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. And why? Yeah, and that's a good way to put it. Why do you say that? What makes you say that?
Because when they publish these at the end of a session, that's it. They're not going back to 2010 and adding new laws in because there's nothing new being passed. That session is closed. Mm-hmm. So you have it there in one spot. And the next session would have a whole new set of laws.
Start all over again. And that's a great way to think of it as a researcher. You can think of how difficult it would be if we were stuck with just these frozen in time session laws to do research. And so in 2010 they pass a bunch of laws, in 2011 they pass a bunch, and there's amendments thrown in there, new laws, and you'd have to flip through and have a bunch of different books open and try to figure out and piece together what these laws are cumulatively. And that's what the code is for. It lets you do that. But at the same time, you can then go back to these individual session laws to see what the language of a law was back at a previous point in time, which is nice.
Unless you committed the crime in 2010.
And then, well, you could still then go back and look up what,
Right, it
what
wouldn't
it was.
impact your research.
Exactly. Yeah.
It may impact your future.
Now, what about doing like legislative history work? Why do we care about session laws if we're trying to look up legislative documents?
Do we care?
Yeah, well, yeah, legislative histories are bare.
They are, and we'll
they
talk
are.
about that in another one of our videos.
Thank you.
But what is it? How does session laws help?
So session laws, because they're the law frozen in time at that moment, you're often using those to piece together what a law looked like at a certain iteration. It's the base for putting together legislative history, which is just the documents that were created when a bill became a law. So every piece that went into that. And you're usually using it to find intent, which you're probably not going to find from the language of the law, but you can see what was important at the time the law was passed versus what's no longer maybe in the law or what's been added. But you're looking at that because you want to see what the law looked like at a certain point in history.
Right. And that's what the legislature was working on. They're not, the legislature is not necessarily working on the code sections. They leave that to the codifiers. The legislature passes a law, then they say, here are codifiers, you figure it out, put it into the code section in the appropriate place. But what the legislature is working on are these acts, like Leslie described before, these single large acts. If you want to see a law in whole, you go to the session laws. And so as a result, any documents they create in that process are going to be attached
And
to
it's
those session
also,
laws.
if it's helpful, things like that you know of as an act, for me it's things like the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act or the Patriot Act. You find those as, a whole in the session laws. You're not necessarily going to find the Patriot Act in one giant piece in the code, but you will find it in one giant piece as it was passed in a session law.
Exactly.